Hello and welcome to the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. We have returned, Bernard, to our spiritual home in the West, the Press Bar on Albion Street in Glasgow. The veteran journalist's watering hole, increasingly populated only by veterans. Such is the state of the Scottish newspaper trade these days. But it's great to be back here. And do you know something that people often ask me, Bernard?
What do they often ask you, Alex?
They ask, how can they support the podcast?
Do they really? Well, that's a good question. And in actual fact, people say to me, how is retirement doing? And I say, poor. Very, very poor. So for veteran journalists who are superannuated and poor, please do get in touch. Do get in touch, because not all of us are in receipt of the largesse from the Times.
Well, by that you mean if you run a business and you would like to sponsor the podcast, then of course we would love to hear from you. If you don't run a business and don't have the wherewithal to sponsor the podcast, you can still help, however, by subscribing to it on your podcast platform of choice, by subscribing to the YouTube feed or the Facebook page, and sharing the podcast with friends and family, and indeed with foes.
Of which there are a few.
Well, quite a number this week. We should probably move on to the topic of today's show, which is a timely one for a number of reasons. A decade ago, if you were to ask people the question, what is a woman? You would have had a fairly straightforward conversation. In fact, an awful lot of people, I think, would be surprised to be asked the question in the first place. But the last decade has seen a remarkable revolution in societal affairs, you could put it like that, I think, in which the concept and definition and meaning of woman and womanhood has become contentious, a battleground in what we might now call the gender wars. And we have with us today, I'm delighted to say, Jenny Lindsay, who's the author of a new book, which I'm holding up a uncorrected proof of for the benefit of those watching on YouTube. Her new book is Hounded, Women, Harms and the Gender Wars. It's out now, published by Polity. And the subtitle there, and indeed the title, I think gives you some indication of the subject matter, because it is a book about how so-called gender-critical feminists have come to their views, why they have felt those views are necessary, and what happens, particularly in the United Kingdom and especially in Scotland, if you articulate views that are suddenly deemed to be out with the gender mainstream, even if those views would have been regarded as impeccably mainstream just a decade ago. So, Jenny, it's lovely to have you with us to talk through some of these issues. And I suppose the first thing to say is, you are a poet, a spoken word performer, a mainstay of the Scottish literary scene in many respects, particularly on the poetry side of things. And yet you have been put it in broad terms, I suppose, a victim of what's come to be termed cancel culture. Now, first of all, just perhaps tell us a bit about yourself, your background, your story, and how it is that you came to be writing this book, and then we'll get into some of the broader issues that emanate from that later.
Okay, Grant. Thanks very much for having me on. First of all, for the last 10 years, I've been a full-time freelance writer, poet, performer, and live literature promoter. That was one of the main ways that I earned a living, by commissioning other writers and poets and playwrights and whatever on a stage, putting on great cabaret nights and variety nights and that kind of thing, and doing a lot of work with literary festivals too. So obviously I was a freelancer, so that's quite a precarious life, as you know. But in terms of coming to this issue and how I came to write this book, in about 2013, I think it was, I started to notice this ideology, scaffolding around me. It was small incidents at first, I say in the book, my first experience of confronting it was when I was running a creative writing workshop, and the organiser did a introductory pronoun circle, which I'd never experienced before. I didn't understand what was happening, and neither did some of the participants at the time. I could see it in their faces. But, it was one time, but then slowly after that, I watched as everybody around me learnt about this ideology. So they learnt what gender identity meant. They learnt what non-binary meant. They learnt that you had to say things like trans women are women over and over again. And I watched as particularly everybody in the arts around me learnt this ideology, learnt the practices that go along with the ideology, and started really trying to embed it in every sort of part of the literary world. Now, my first confrontation with the ideology was, I must be missing something. I must be, because this doesn't seem correct at all. And so I went away, I looked at it, I studied it, I researched it, I listened to what people were saying about the ideology, about why they held it, and I realised, well, I completely disagree. At the same time, I noticed what was being done to women who said that. So I was sitting on the sidelines going, I am very worried about this. I'm very, very worried about this arriving on our shores. The violence of the activism that I'd seen in Canada in particular was really, really frightening. And then sure enough, the violence did arrive on our doors, didn't it? It arrived with pots and pans screaming outside the drill hall in Dalmeny Street at the first Women's Place UK meeting. And I actually knew some of the people involved in organising these protests. So I was sitting there going, I have friends who I think might be a little bit aggressive. How on earth am I going to speak out about this? And eventually I decided I just had to, because I thought, well, there's 3 things that I believe that seem to be the issue. And I'm not going to apologise for any of them, because I think they're correct. So the first one is that I think that women are materially definable as a category of human being, i.e. we are adult human females. That has become a dog whistle is not feminists' fault. That is the fault of the aggressive people who want to say that women are not materially definable. I think we are, and I don't think there's anything wrong in saying so. The second core belief is that women, on the basis of being female, deserve, or we have our own needs, rights and concerns. I mean, that's a status quo position. That's the legal position in the UK, is that on the basis of sex, women have rights. Again, that wouldn't have been controversial 10 years ago. But that's the main battleground, actually, over which everything has been fought. And the third thing, and the thing that I got pulled over the hot coals for, is that I think that women should have unfettered right to freedom of speech and assembly on matters that affect them profoundly. So the third core belief there is, as I say, I'd seen the aggressive activism and the shutting down of debate and discussion. And the Skinny Arts magazine published a column by a well-known gender identity activist who was justifying his calls for incitement to violence against lesbian protesters at a Pride march. I got sent this by a good friend, this column, with a sort of WTF, because we both knew this activist, and this activist had actually gone after that particular friend. She's a film critic, and this person tried to get her fired from, various publications. So I was aware of this columnist. I read the column and I couldn't believe it had passed editorial, oversight or whatever. And so I made one tweet. I admit I had 2 glasses of wine, and I was in a very bad mood that day as well. But it was a very polite tweet to the Skinny, just saying, hello, one of your commentators here advocates violence against lesbians at Pride. That's an extraordinary thing to read in the Skinny. And my life changed overnight, because what happens if you express anything that goes against gender identity ideology, if you express any of those 3 core beliefs, anything you say gets twisted, it gets mangled. So all of a sudden it was like, Jenny Lindsay thinks all trans women are violent, Jenny Lindsay hates trans people, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I'm saying blah, 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 blah. It was very extreme at the time. So, quite a mad week. And then my entire life just went completely insane.
We want to get into some of the details of this stuff. Let's go back to 2013, because you said that this first came on your radar at this workshop where people had to be schooled in pronouns and the use of pronouns, and you now define this as an ideology. And of course, with ideologies, they have anchors and there are layers to them. So this comes across your radar in 2013. You start doing a little bit of delving into what's behind this. What is it people are campaigning for? Because ostensibly it is portrayed as a human rights issue. It's portrayed as an issue of respecting people who are different. When you delved into it, what did you actually find the layers of that ideology we're arguing for.
Well, the thing was, I mean, the reason I'm saying it's gender identity ideology and the reason I use gender identity activism is this isn't actually at root about trans people. So I've known trans people in the literary arts for like 20 years. I didn't get the impression that what was being asked for was to be viewed literally as the opposite sex and to be treated literally as the opposite sex. So that was what was new to me. Most people sort of had the story that if you're trans, that means you've got a condition called gender dysphoria that's incredibly difficult to live with. That means that sometimes you legally change birth certificates. I hadn't really given it much thought, to be honest with you, because one just didn't, So the ideology that I started delving into was, as I say, it was just the opposite of my own core beliefs. So it was saying that women in particular, I mean man as well, but women mostly, is a subjective category. It should be it's a social category. It's not a biological one. It's a social one that anybody who feels like a woman is a woman. I mean, that's a circular definition for a start. So, the Orwell scholar in me was already twitching. But
you said, Jenny, that you knew a lot of trans people, because there are splits within the trans community. This is not a homogeneous group.
No, it's not.
Who all sign up to a specific ideology and a specific way of looking at and identifying and defining gender.
Yeah, and gender identity activists are both trans and cis identifying. So the majority of my hounders are what you would call cis identifying. So cis, according to the ideology, means on the opposite side. No, is it on the same side as? So using the language of the ideology, which I have learnt, so I can dismantle it. If you're cis identifying, your gender identity matches the gender you were assigned at birth. So again, all of this language, twitching, because I've studied Orwell and I know what's going on here. Because what's happening there is they're trying to say that sex is not a materially definable thing about you. What makes you a man or a woman is a subjective gender identity that is randomly assigned to you by a medical practitioner. So I mean, that was part of what I realised was happening, and also that all of the legislative rights and protections afforded to women should be afforded to males who identify as women. No, sorry, that's really dangerous, and the consequences of holding gender identity beliefs about women and enshrining gender identity beliefs into law, the consequences of that for women, for young people, for lesbians, for gays, is extreme, and we have seen that, and we have been proven right on that time and time again.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure we'll get into some of the political ramifications and aspects of this in due course and so on. But I think if we go back to your own hounding, as you put it, and in the book you're very clear that this is your story happens to be your own, but it is similar in certain characteristics to the way an awful lot of it tends to be women have been sort of harassed or forced out of jobs, not just in the arts, but in academia as well, for expressing what are now termed gender critical viewpoints. So you said that after you'd suggested that, well, hang on a minute, this arts magazine, The Skinny and so on, are you really comfortable publishing sort of endorsements of violence against lesbians at Pride in Edinburgh and so on? And then you say your whole world changes. What happens?
Well, I had 7 months of what I would call quiet cancellation. So after that sort of initial flurry on Twitter, and I must say I wasn't really a Twitter person, so I was not used to waking
Good
up.
on you.
Now I'm afraid I've had to become as addicted as everyone else to it, I'm afraid. But at the time, I really wasn't somebody who used Twitter a lot, and certainly not to have political discussions. I had maybe a couple of thousand of followers or whatever. And so, I had to get used to waking up to like that horrible 20 plus notifications signal, which still gives me the heebie-jeebies when it happens. But what happened was lots of sort of private conversations, friends in the arts sort of sidling into my DMs and saying, oh, I've just spoken to such and such and they're saying that you're a TERF and that they don't want you to come into, lots of schoolyard stuff.
We should explain
Turf.
what
Yeah.
turf is, and so
okay.
on, because not everybody is quite as au fait with the current terminology.
True. Yeah, yes.
Lucky them, perhaps.
Yes, lucky them. TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It's viewed very much as an insult. It's used as a way to shut down discussion, and as a woman, if you get that label, everything in my book happens to you. So, I mean, what happened to me for 7 months, as I say, was quite quiet. It exploded publicly again in February 2020, when a young male poet I have never met attempted to get me no platform for. Well, he was hinting that the organisers of a conference at the University of Strathclyde were, platforming a huge turf.
And bigots. In other words,
basically.
yeah.
So he was going after a small publisher, which ironically he was actually published by. I mean, I don't understand these people and the artists, to be honest with you. The entitlement is off the scale. But anyway, he was trying to get me no platform from this conference. And then everybody just started piling on again. I tried to challenge him again as politely as I possibly could. And then it all spiralled to the point where the Scottish Poetry Library stepped in. And they issued a statement saying, we will no longer ignore attempts by poets to no platform other poets. So this was an institution very rarely in this fight actually showing a little bit of leadership, and if all arts organisations could have just done the same thing, maybe a lot of this wouldn't have happened. But essentially, as you say, I don't really want to centre my own story. People can Google it and look at it. I've written about it extensively. My own hounding follows exactly the same pattern that other women have experienced.
But in terms of the cancel culture and the people who were doing the cancelling, presumably you knew most of them. You knew most of them fairly well. Was the cancel culture as a result of the fact that the people who were doing the cancelling had signed up to this new ideology, or was it a case that they perhaps didn't understand the ramifications of this ideology, but they were concerned about reputational damage as a result of people who subscribed to this ideology making a lot of noise and hanging the label bigot around them, not only personally but corporately? In other words, they didn't actually have a policy on this. They were just allowing themselves to be bounced around by people that they didn't understand but were feared of.
Yes, I mean, like all totalist ideologies, it's propped up by people who really don't understand it, but who know that you shouldn't question it and that your life will be made hell. To be honest with you, though, there are many motivations why somebody might get involved in gender identity activism. I'm not going to take away from the fact that some people do profoundly disagree with my views. I would say that's probably the small number of people who lead on these things. But in precarious industries like the arts, like academia, like the media, getting your competition out of the way is, something you might want to do by calling somebody a turf, and I'm sure the motivations of my own hounders are very varied. In terms of not understanding the ideology, that is a huge reason that this ideology is spread. People genuinely don't seem to have a clue about some of it. I've seen some of my own hounders put out strange tweets about what they think our views are, women like myself, and they really don't understand it. I've got an example in the book, actually, from the University of Edinburgh, which faced a massive protest when they did a book launch for the Sex and Gender anthology that was published by Routledge a couple of years ago. And one of the protesters was a young man. He looked to be about 30, and he was sort of shoving himself in the way of this elderly woman who's trying to get into the building. All these young people are there with the placards and the signs waving, TERFs go home, and all this kind of stuff. And there was this excellent he was a student reporter. He did some excellent work actually that night, and he was going around interviewing the protesters and the attendees and all the rest of it. And he was asked by the student reporter, this young activist, why he was out protesting. And his response was, well, I don't know too much about the book or its contents, but people in gender studies have condemned it, and I trust their condemnation. It's absolutely astonishing. I mean, also though, this ideology isn't compelling for me, but it seems to be really compelling for a lot of people. And I think once they've sort of learnt the lingo, learnt the ideology, learnt what you're allowed to say, learnt to make it logical in their heads, then they have to keep going with that. And also the harms of this ideology, the primary harms of this ideology aren't the focus of my book. The focus of my book is the secondary harms to women who speak out about the ideology. But the ideology is causing concrete harms that a lot of people really probably don't want to admit that they've been part of supporting.
Yeah, I mean, but it continues. I mean, you obviously, you lost quite a lot of work. You moved out of Edinburgh back to Ayrshire, didn't you? And then, you're writing this book, and then there's a new flurry of stuff. It becomes there are lots of things intertwined here. There are speech issues. There's an extraordinary story reported initially by the Daily Mail about a literature officer at Creative Scotland phoning up at least one bookshop demanding that it refuse to stock your book, Hounded. Now, this is somebody who's ostensibly paid by Creative Scotland, paid by the public purse in large part, to promote literature, actively trying to suppress your potential earnings from your work.
It was,
and just to, if I understand it correctly, Creative Scotland investigated this after you made them aware of it, didn't you? And they found that, well, yes, perhaps this person had acted poorly, but it wasn't any kind of sacking offence.
Well, I mean, I've got no idea what happened. I was under the impression, well, I'll go back to the beginning. Yes, within 24 hours of me announcing that this book was coming out, a small independent Edinburgh bookshop put it on sale for pre-orders. This caught the attention of a Creative Scotland literature officer. And she contacted them and made them aware that there could be consequences if they, kept it on sale and that kind of thing. That's what I'm aware of. I don't know if she contacted other places. I've got no idea. I'm fairly sure there'll be private things going on from that world. They don't tend to operate in Twitter anymore. So I can't see what they're up to, but I'm sure there are multiple things like that happening. But the reason I was almost laughing there is it's just like, it's in the book. This has happened to other women. Every single tactic that my hounders have used on me has been used and is in the book about other women. So that was extraordinary. And I will say, I hadn't wanted that story to come out initially because it's like leading up to my launches. I just wanted a quiet summer. I was like, I'm going to do the keto and get fit, But the story came out, yes, and it was all over the press. And of course, as always happens when I am all over the press, I get blamed for the attacks that Ms. Tarbuck had. But yes, as you say, it's an extraordinary thing. I did report it to Creative Scotland because I felt that I didn't ask for her to be sacked, but I thought it was a disciplinary issue. And I felt, and I will say as well, this might astonish people, I've got a live Creative Scotland application at the moment. Yes. So this is completely bonkers, you know what I mean? So of course I had to report it because I couldn't have someone who obviously thinks I'm that dangerous judging my applications.
But what do you, make of a situation where Creative Scotland was created some time ago? The essence, in a sense, of the arts, in its broadest sense, is to give voice to everybody, people with different views, unfashionable views, different takes. The essence, in a sense, of, I think, pure art forms is that there is no censorship under most circumstances. There might well be some things which you wouldn't want to fund. But when you get an organisation like Creative Scotland, which is spending public money, which is spending taxpayers' money which is accountable to the Scottish Parliament through a relevant minister, that wishes to start cancelling people and to define creativity and artistic endeavour in a narrow way, it beggars belief.
Yeah, there's a few different things going on there. I will say Creative Scotland have repeatedly put out the line that I was happy with the process. That's only half true. I was happy that they'd been taking it seriously, but I hadn't been made aware that the outcome of their investigation was we're going to do sod all. I'm not happy with that at all. So I've just put that in the record just now, actually. But with Creative Scotland, with lots of other arts organisations, yes, making this ideology mandatory seems to have become something that they all think they have to do. You see it in their equality and diversity forms that you have to fill in as a freelancer. To me, there is absolutely no point being a creative writer, being a writer of any kind, if you're forced to go along with or say things that you don't think are true. And I don't think gender identity ideology is true. It's not my belief system. I'm not doing it. I'm not going along with it. And the arts has created a culture where questioning that.
And who took that decision?
Nobody. It scaffolded around us, and everybody was made aware that at the same time as the scaffolding was built, you weren't allowed to say, "Oh, look, scaffolding." You know, that's what it feels like. You weren't allowed to question it. It was just, right, this is how we do things now.
But the scaffolding is being erected by those who subscribe to the ideology. But
no, not necessarily. Some of the people. Here's an example, actually. Of course, this is anecdotal, but I had a good friend who worked for one of these arts organisations. So we're having a drink. This is about 2016. And we were outside a pub in Tollcross, as I used to do quite a lot. And I happened to mention the name of a mutual friend of ours who had only recently started identifying as non-binary. But I was using male pronouns because I'd known this person for a long, long time. My friend's face sort of twitched and she was like, can I just check, do we use they now? I want to make sure we're getting this right at work. That's how this is scaffolded, people wanting to get it right at work. And a lot of people have thought, well, you know, this will look good in my CV if I bring in the trans inclusion policy, it's all of these different things. So it's not just the true believers, it's the do-gooders, it's the people who think this is what we're supposed to be doing now, it's the people who say, oh, well, I don't like it, but this is what we do now. So there's a whole lot of other things going on.
I mean, there are lots of argument lines to these discussions and so on. Because on the one hand, you have how should we treat people as individuals, and it seems, you know, I think perfectly reasonable to say that if somebody wants to identify as a man or a woman, then it's reasonable in a personal environment to treat them as such. That's simple.
That's where I was at. Yeah,
good manners. But there is a difference, isn't there, when you move then into the political and legal realm, where you suddenly get the Scottish Government arguing in court, for instance, that we no longer believe that sex is immutable, that people can, there's a sort of conflation of sex with gender, and you have the Scottish Government bringing in its gender reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, that would have allowed people to identify effectively however they would like, you know, to remove the requirement for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before getting a gender recognition certificate that allows people to access certain services, and to remove the gatekeeping as it's seen. You know, this is seen as an oppressive thing. It's anti-trans. It's a way of thwarting people, preventing people from living the lives they want to their fullest. And so you have the thing of be kind becomes a kind of mantra. And at the political level, then, there's also a thing of no debate, isn't there? That actually this is not an area in which there should be discussion. It's not an area in which there are competing viewpoints that are worthy of respect in a democratic society. There is actually no argument to be had. And that, at a political level, that becomes very difficult, I think, doesn't it? And it's led in Scotland from the very top, because Nicola Sturgeon is First Minister and leader of the SNP. It's her government pushing these reforms, gender reforms through, and she literally says no debate, doesn't she? Yeah,
she also called us borderline racists, so that was fun. Nicola Sturgeon has been responsible for a lot of the harms that have been done in Scotland. What she appears to have done is seized on this as a progressive, in air quotes, cause, and really just gone for it and not listened to any sort of detractors at all.
Do you think she understands the ideology?
I think that she has forced herself to become a true believer. I don't know the woman, so I can't really comment any further than that, but she appears to, the way that she conducts herself in this debate, even after Isla Bryson, this is in the book, even after Isla Bryson, she was accepting this sort of glittery award at a ceremony, and she repeated the line that extending rights to trans people takes nothing away from women. It's astonishing, the sort of the levels of willingness to say there's nothing to see here. There are no harms. It's really psychologically abusive, to be honest with you, to women who've been really harmed by this ideology too. But I mean, Scotland has felt like a particularly intense place for the last 10 years. I'm sure you'll all agree for different reasons, perhaps. But the way that the SNP pushed this and the rhetoric from the Scottish Greens, I mean, sometimes my jaw has been on the floor listening to some of the things that have come from the Scottish Greens, but also, I suppose, in the arts as well. Scotland's really small and it's really incestuous. So a lot of the arts and the politics sort of mixes, and watching writers all around me say, "You must not question the government." I was like, "What the hell is this?" You know, it was astonishing.
You talked about, turning on the phone, and you got involved in Twitter and reading it with a sense of dread. I mean, I worked as a political editor for 19 years and have never tweeted once because I'm aware of and I don't follow it even to this day, but I'm aware of the sort of the anger, the broad anger that's always out there, and it's a conductor for anger, and it's a conductor for people who are frankly mad, bad, and unhinged. What was your lowest point? Because first of all, what you're doing is courageous in terms of the public discourse, and I think that should be absolutely recognised. But when you take part in the public discourse, there is always a downside, which is that you are going to be attacked. And, people are attacked and, folk have emotions. What for you was the lowest point in all of this? Can
I quickly say something about social media? First of all, the reason that social media became the battleground is because of a lack of legislative leadership. Because our politicians were not discussing this, we had to find places to speak. And Twitter, unfortunately, became that site because that's where gender identity activism was pushing.
Yeah.
And so we had to engage with it on the battleground that was made for us. And unfortunately, Nicola Sturgeon and various other politicians were using Twitter as an unpaid focus group for their policies. So we had to be on there. I mean, I hate it as well because I find social media really stressful because it's public. And you're right, yes, I won't go into my own lowest point because I don't want to make you all cry. And I don't want to get my hounders saying things like, "Oh, here come the white women's tears," which is they think it's funny. So my lowest point was not nice. And it was in 2019, actually, before everything went massively public. There was almost a relief when it was all out there because I was like, look what's happening, everyone. Isn't it unhinged? And after I wrote my essay for the Dark Horse Literary Magazine in 2020, I felt a lot of relief that I just set everything out that's happened. The lowest point comes when you can't... once you get the label TERF, there's no way to get rid of it. People don't look into what it was you said that got you that label. And when people have gone back and looked at what my tweet said, I don't think I've done an interview yet where somebody hasn't said, "There must have been more to it than that, right?" And I'm like, yes and no. And the hardest part for every woman differs, but I think one of the most common from women in the arts that I've spoken to, both for the book and privately, is you're not losing just your livelihood, you're losing your vocation when you're an artist or a writer. And, it's not... Right, I like performance poetry. I know most people don't, but I really do, right? And I'd managed to make it cool.
We won't hold that against you.
Yes, I know. You've slagged me off on Twitter for being a poet. But, I liked it. I thought it was really good art form. I really enjoyed it. And I actually found it an audience. And I built that up since the age of about 20. And it all disappeared in 7 months. That was the hardest part.
Yeah.
And watching what has replaced it, I won't be too much of it. A bit. But, watching what has replaced the old scene makes me furious, actually.
Because, it is a form of sort of ostracism, isn't it? And, it's one of these areas where a lot of people have been very reluctant to get involved in this subject because either they're baffled by it or they think, well, it's so toxic, I don't want to get involved. And so you have an awful lot of people, a lot of the men, it has to be said, who are brave truth tellers on a whole range of other issues and so on, who suddenly lose their voice on this one. But Scotland is a small place, and the arts community within Scotland is an even smaller place. And so when you have these sort of fierce, almost hurricane-level storms of controversy and so on, they are intensified by the very smallness of the environment in which they're taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that's why I had to continue speaking out and continue writing and lay everything out that had happened, because there was all this rumour and weirdness and all the rest of it, and people going, oh, I kind of know that Jenny Lindsay is associated with something toxic that I don't want to touch. But, unless I was just going to go and disappear entirely, like jump in the sea or something, I had to write my way out of this, because Scotland is too small for this. It's way too small for it.
And, this is very much a woman's cause in many ways, although it seems to me that since women take up 50% of the population, by definition has to be of interest to rather more than just, can't just be relegated to a woman's issue and therefore deemed marginal or of little consequence, because the question of single-sex spaces, most of the time in most circumstances there may well not be any kind of clash between what we term trans rights and women's rights, but when it comes to, say, sport or most obviously prison and associations and so on, there may be times when there are conflicts, and the argument, it seems, has been at a political level between those who accept that there will be occasional moments of conflict and therefore we need to find a way through this, and those who deny that there could ever be any kind of conflict. And that's not something that has arisen by accident, is it? I mean, if you look at, say, the Scottish Prison Service, which has effectively operated on a policy of self-identification for inmates and would-be inmates for many years, well in advance of the government passing a bill that would have allowed this on a more formal basis.
Yeah, it's 10 years.
Yeah. And that's on the basis of lobbying from Scottish Trans and other organisations and so on the grounds that if we can introduce self-ID in an environment as challenging as a prison, then it becomes much easier to have that everywhere else.
Yep. And that was all by design, and they weren't hiding it. I mean, this is the thing. If you read the very compelling book, Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows, it's all there. This plan is all set out. This was the plan, was to render the category definition of women fluid, and to say trans women are women, and to get that into and to frame it, as you say, as a moral issue. It's about being kind. It's about showing that trans people aren't dangerous. That's not the point. The point is whether somebody is male or female. And I understand that in the arts, like a lot of people, because they knew the same trans people I did, were like, oh no, I can't believe that you're saying such and such is dangerous. I'm like, I'm not. I'm saying they're male though, and that is sometimes relevant to to service provision, for goodness sake.
Yeah, hence the recent controversies over Edinburgh Rape Crisis
Centre. Oh, for goodness sake, yes.
And the Scottish Parliament passes its gender recognition reforms, and then it is, I suppose, an accident of timing, a coincidence of timing, that 3 weeks later you have the Adam Graham stroke Isla Bryson case, where you have someone convicted on 2 counts of rape, and the prison service are happy to send them off to Caunton Vale. Questions are obviously asked at Holyrood about this. Nicola Sturgeon gives the impression in some of her answers to questions about this that we now have 3 sexes in Scotland, male, female and rapist, because the individual, who is not to be assigned pronouns suddenly, it's a one-off case and so on. We shouldn't make too much about it.
Yeah, it wasn't funny, obviously, but it was just astonishing watching her stumble over that, and Jenny Go-Ruth and other politicians as well. It was utterly astonishing, and still they doubled down, as I show in my book in the social harms chapter, which is about obviously the very public and also very private types of activism that affect women who've spoken out about these things. A great deal of the social harms, the violent and aggressive protests outside events in my book come post Bryson. Gender identity activists are doubling down something rotten because it's indefensible. You cannot defend putting male rapists in women's prisons. This has been happening for 10 years. It is not new with Isla Bryson, Adam Graham. It's not new. It's been going on for a very long time and still is. And all of these things have been going on at Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre as well, as you say. And I must say, the arts world's, the poetry world, the Edinburgh Poetry World's response to the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre event was to run a fundraiser for ERCC while Ros Adams' case was ongoing. Right. I mean, my disdain for my former world is off the charts at this point. But this is the climate that Scotland has created.
The job of any parliament in terms of its legislative process is to ensure, in a sense, that bad laws don't happen, because normally the process is that you will consult, you will put the details of legislation through a committee system. Civic Scotland will engage with the legislative process to try and fill it out anything which is manifestly absurd. And yet we ended up with this piece of legislation because probably some people don't understand the ideology. Some people are scared of tackling it. Some people think it's the easy thing to do, is the politically correct thing to do. Do you think that our national parliament, which is supposed to make sure that it gets its legislation right, simply sleptwalked into all of this?
I think there were a few things going on. I interviewed former MSP Joan McAlpine for the Democratic Harms chapter, and I wanted to interview someone who was a former MSP so they could be more candid, and I thought she was a good one. So
Joan is always candid.
It was a brilliant interview, and she said that she's heard that with Scottish Labour, the reason that they all voted for it was they wanted to get it out the way so they could move on. Now, as somebody who earns, I think, a tenth of what an MSP does, who has, I mean, thanks for calling me courageous. I really haven't felt much choice but to speak out, but thank you. As somebody who earns a tenth of a legislator's wage, hearing that legislators were willing to put through, as you say, terrible legislation, that some of them knew was terrible legislation just so they could move on. I mean, I'd quite like to move on, to be honest with you, but I can't, because the only way out of this ridiculous situation is through it, which means we're going to have to keep talking about it. But yes, I think this the passing of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill of Scotland is the most disgraceful episode in the Scottish Parliament's history. It showed up all of the issues with that system, and it needs it urgently needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that bill obviously then is effectively vetoed, cancelled, you might say, by Alistair Jack in his role as Secretary of State for Scotland, and the courts uphold his reason to block it on the grounds that there are spillover effects in terms of the application of the Equality Act elsewhere in the UK.
Can I just say, if Sturgeon had listened to women, she would have known, because we have been saying that for many, many years.
Yeah. And as a result, the Labour government, new Labour government, is not going to be pressing ahead, I think, with its own previous proposals for introducing self-ID or reforming gender recognition in England and Wales. And in a sense, Scotland has become a kind of laboratory certainly within the UK for many of these issues. What lessons do you think have been learned, and then perhaps subsequent to that, what lessons should be learned?
Well, I don't know what has been learned by our legislators. A lot of them have doubled down, haven't they? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with the SNP. I really don't. But I think that there are, from my point of view, there are promising things starting to happen, I think, in culture, with some of the literary organisations, with some of the literary festivals as well. So hopefully they'll start to become places where we can actually even have these discussions. I don't know that the SNP, I certainly don't think Nicola Sturgeon has learned anything from this entire episode. She doesn't appear to have. And I don't know what Scottish Labour are playing at, because this is an open goal. You could come out and you could say, look, we got that really, really badly wrong. Dear women of Scotland, we're very sorry, we're very stupid, and please give us your votes. But they're not. It seems they're not doing that. The Scottish Tories are all over this. They're the only party who stood up for women. That's ridiculous. You're making me like Tories, guys. Come on.
Well, that's been, I think, quite a full discussion. The book is called Hounded. Women, Harms and the Gender Wars. So if you want to know in more detail some of the issues that Jenny has been talking about over the course of the last hour, go out and buy it. First of all, thank you very much for your time. It's genuinely been quite an educational hour from my point of view. It really has. And I wish you all the best, not only in the campaign, I wish you all the best in finding work and in pursuing what you rightly describe as your vocation.
Thank you very much.
No, it's been lovely to have you, Jenny. And Sonin, if you have any comments on some of the issues that we've been talking about here today, do please get in touch. It's ponsonbymassie@gmail.com, and that is also the handle on Twitter, where we can be relied on to have a sensible and sane and restrained, nuanced discussion of these and other issues.
And then we'll have Alec Massie make a contribution.
Well, sometimes once you've unpinned a grenade, Bernard, you do have to throw it, because otherwise it will blow up in your own paw. So thank you very much to Jenny Lindsay for joining us. And from the Press Bar in Glasgow, it is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.